Good morning. I'm Steve Lagoon, and I'm the president of Religion Analysis Service in Minnesota. And our topic this morning is in defense of Luke's census, based on the passage in the Gospel of Luke 2, 1 through 7. Critics, this is a favorite target of critics, as we'll see. The passage reads, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child." So that's the passage that is at issue. The issues raised by Luke's critics include they claim that Luke erred by wrongly dating the AD 6 census back into the time of Herod the Great. Likewise, critics claim there is no historical evidence for a Roman census during the reign of Herod the Great. Critics claim Luke erred by suggesting that the Romans would even conduct a census in a vassal king's territory. And critics claim that Luke also erred by suggesting that a Roman census required citizens to return to their ancestral homes. And some critics question whether Mary would have accompanied Joseph on this perilous journey. Well, William Ramsey, the great Christian apologist and archaeologist, summed up the position of Luke's critics. It has been maintained by many scholars in modern times that the census is either fiction or blunder, that the circumstances connected with it, which Luke relates, are contrary to history, and in short, that the story is unhistorical and impossible. It has been urged with triumphant certainty, as established on incontrovertible evidence, that the whole story, with all its pathetic and romantic incidents, is a mere fiction, destitute of even as much as a historical foundation as most historical novels possess. It is asserted as a demonstrated truth that the story contradicts the established facts of contemporary history, and that anyone who accepts the ordinary canons of historical reasoning must relegate the whole tale of the birth of Christ to the realm of imaginative fiction. So he really lays out the case of the critics. But William Ramsey, of course, wrote a whole book in defense of Luke's census. Albert Edersheim, the expert on first century Judaism, said, "A counting of the people, or census, and that census taken at the bidding of the heathen emperor and executed by one so universally hated as Herod, would represent the ne plus ultra of all that was most repugnant to Jewish feeling. If the account of the circumstances which brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem had no basis in fact, but is a legend invented to locate the birth of the Nazarene in the royal city of David, it must be pronounced clumsily devised. There is nothing, absolutely nothing to account for its origination." Jack Finnegan was a chronologist and historian, and he said, summing up his view, "In view of Luke's general accuracy in other chronological matters, there seems no sufficient grounds to question his accuracy in speaking of the position of Quirinius in relation to an enrollment at the time of the birth of Jesus." So, looking specifically at the census in Luke 2, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria." So the problem is, what census is this? Critics have pointed out that the apparent historical problems associated with Luke's claim of a census made while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And they know about his census taken in 86, which even Luke describes in Acts 5:37. But that was in 86, 10 years at least later than the time of Herod the Great. And we know Christ was born during the reign of Herod the Great. So how do we solve this problem? The problem being that we know about the census in 86. Did Luke really mess up by projecting back in time this date of Cernius census back into the time of Herod the Great? How do we solve that problem? Well, the critics suggest that there's nowhere to put this census. On the left side of the screen, you can see a list of the governors of Syria, which Syria also included Palestine and Israel. And the infidels on their website say, look, there's no place for a census by Quirinius in the list of governors that we know through history. Jack Finnegan, also on the right-hand side, has a similar one. And both of them have an interesting gap if you take a close look between Gaius Caesar and Saturninus. There's a gap there, a little bit of a gap.
Steve, what do you mean Syria included Palestine and Israel?
So under Roman governance, the province of Syria included Israel.
So it was a province. It's
Yeah.
kind of like the United States and Illinois.
Right, but under the Romans, the governor of Syria also governed Israel at that time. And later on, of course, we'll have Pontius Pilate, but this is earlier than that. So, critics suggest there's no room for Luke's census under Quirinius during the time of Herod the Great. Fitzmyer in the Anchor Bible says the problem is that we have a fairly complete list of Roman governors of Syria, the known legates of the province of Syria. But let us note that a fairly complete list is not an exhaustive list. And as I showed there are gaps. If we look here, there are gaps right about the time that most historians believe in the birth of Christ, still at the tail end of Herod the Great's reign. Solutions to dating Luke's census then. There has been several solutions proposed, and I don't know which is the correct one, but there's several possible solutions, any one of which would be a reasonable solution to the problem. The first one, there could have been two different Quiriniuses associated with the governance of Syria. B, Quirinius himself could have been a governor on two separate occasions. 3, Quirinius was a co-ruler of Syria. Or the last one, a linguistic analysis of Luke 2 removes the apparent problem as alternate translations show. Excuse me. So let's look at each of these in turn. There could have been two different Quiriniuses associated with the governorate of Syria. An archaeologist named Jerry Vardaman is reported to have found a coin in the area of Syria dating to 11 BC with the name Quirinius in micrographic lettering, suggesting a different ruler with the same name. That's not altogether uncommon. We've had Presidents George Bush and then his son George W. Bush that governed about a decade apart. So there could have been two Quiriniuses, two separate Quiriniuses. The second solution is that Quirinius himself was governor of Syria on two separate occasions. It is quite reasonable to suppose that Quirinius ruled as governor on two separate occasions, the one we know about in 86-7, but also a decade earlier during the reign of Herod the Great. Again, this is not unusual. Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and the 24th president of the United States. Our current president, President Trump, was also the 45th president and the 47th. In my home state, Rudy Perpich was the governor of Minnesota, both the 34th and the 36th. So it's not unusual for someone to be a ruler, then have a period where they're not the ruler, and then come back into power And it's very reasonable to suppose that that could have happened with Quirinius. That Quirinius governed Syria twice. There is evidence called the Lapis Tibertinus, and it's an archaeological find that suggests that there was a particular unnamed person, that part that names the governor, that part of it that identifies him was broken off from the archaeological find. But the Lapis Tibertinus shows that there was a man, without a doubt, who governed Syria at that time, who governed on two different occasions. The only question is, does it refer to Quirinius or to another governor like Varus? Either way, it shows that it's not unusual for someone to have governed at that time frame the Syria twice. So it may have been Quirinius and it may have been Varus, but it still supports Luke's claim regarding the census by Quirinius. So Quirinius governed Syria twice. When would have Quirinius first governed Syria? William Ramsey says the supreme authority on the subject, Monson, considers that the most probable date for Quirinius' first government of Syria is about BC 3-1. Darrell Bach refers to Ian Sherwin-White, who suggested that Quirinius was a legate between Varus and Caesar from 4 BC to 1 BC. This time frame coincides with the only governorship gap we have in the historical records, which we looked at earlier and saw that there is a little gap there that would fit perfectly for the timing of Luke's census. In addition to his governorship of Syria in 86, Quirinius may have co-ruled earlier. So this is a little different than saying that he ruled on two separate occasions as governor. We know he ruled in 86-7, but it could be that this earlier rule was a co-rulership with one of the others. And so Ramsey, this is one of Ramsey's theories, the first periodic enrollment of Syria was made under Saturninus in BC 87. The enrollment of Palestine was delayed by the causes described until the late summer or autumn of BC 6. At that time, Varus was controlling the internal affairs of Syria, while Quirinius was commanding its armies and directing its foreign policy. Ramsey goes on to say, Luke does not specify exactly what was the Roman office which Quirinius held at the time when this first enrollment was made. The word is employed by Luke might be applied to any Roman official holding a leading or authoritative position in the province of Syria. So Luke's language doesn't demand that during the census that Quirinius was a governor, but some important governing official. Greg Boyd backs that up. He said, we learn from Tacitus and Florus that Quirinius led large military expeditions in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire a decade before his holding the governor's office in AD 6. He thus obviously held some significant leadership position at this time. It is not unlikely, therefore, that in Luke, in using the general participle hegemonuo, is referring to the governing position or possibly even to an official joint rule at this time prior to becoming formal governor in AD 6. Ramsey in particular was convinced that this was the case. So that's a very reasonable solution. Now, another solution is not to look for historical solutions, but look for a way of translating Luke's words that makes more sense. So we'll look at a couple of those proposals. So again, the language, and this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Note the word first. Prote is the Greek word. Compton explained, textual and grammatical evidence allows for other readings of Luke's text, readings which do not demand that Quirinius was governor of Syria. that it was contemporaneous with Herod's reign or Christ's birth. So let's look at some of those proposals. Compton himself said, solutions involving textual and grammatical evidence suggest either one of the following understandings of prote, which again, some translations say first, but number one, prote, normally a superlative, could be a comparative and thus render a translation. This census was before the census which Quirinius, governor of Syria, made, or two, another alternative possibility. Prote could be adverbial and thus render a translation. This census took place before Quirinius was governor of Syria. Both are quite promising, for in both the difficulty of Luke's reference to Quirinius is mitigated, since either allows for something other than a reference to a census taken at the time of Jesus' birth and under the oversight of Governor Quirinius. Both of Compton's options decouple Luke 2 from referring to a census taken by Quirinius before the well-known one in AD 6-7. Luke is either referring to a census before that of Quirinius in AD 6 or before Quirinius was governor. In other words, the only real difference between the two Compton's options is whether before refers to Quirinius' census or Quirinius' governorship. Either translation removes the problem of discovering a historical census under Quirinius other than the AD 6 census. In that case, Luke's census would have been administered by someone other than Quirinius. This census took place before Quirinius. And so Gleason Archer explains that view. A census under Quirinius before his AD census. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's how the NIV has it. Luke is asserting that there were two censuses under the leadership of Quirinius, and that Luke's nativity description was the first of the two. So Compton was talking about in two ways of translating it that would say this was before Quirinius was governor, but Archer is saying that he's referring to a second census by Quirinius before the 86 one. So this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Luke is asserting that there were two censuses under the leadership of Quirinius, and that Luke's nativity description was the first of the two. And as evidence to support that, it would have been redundant for Luke to say this was the first enrollment if there were not another. Otherwise, Luke could have simply stated, this is the enrollment that took place while Quirinius was governor. So the language suggests that there may have been, yes, you know about the very famous one in 86, but this is one before that that is less known. And so Archer says, in his Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, Luke says this was a first enrollment that took place under Quirinius. Hate apographe agoneto, a first surely implies a second, sometime later. Luke was therefore well aware of the second census taken by Quirinius, again in 87, which Josephus alludes to. We know this because Luke, who lived much closer to the time than Josephus did, also quotes Gamaliel as alluding to the insurrection of Judas of Galilee in the days of the census taking. So we have to give Luke some credit that he knows. He refers to the later census in his book of Acts, Acts 5:37. And so give Luke credit that he knows that this is referring to, in this series, an earlier census during the time of Herod the Great. Do the early church fathers have anything to present? Leon Morris tells us that Justin, in the middle of the 2nd century, assures the Romans that they can see the registers of Quirinius' census. So for the skeptics who doubt Luke's census, who think it's a myth or a creation of Luke, Justin the martyr said you can go and look for yourself and see the records. Now they're not available to us anymore, but they were then. The great chronologist Finnegan said, from a relatively early time, Christian writers declared that it was possible to verify the census in official Roman records. Justin Martyr speaks of the registers of the taxing made under Cyrenius, Apology 134, and Tertullian, mentions the record of the census kept in the archives of Rome against Marcion 47. These records have not been found by archaeologists, but they were there at the time of Justin Martyr and Tertullian in the 2nd century. Claim there is no record of Luke's census is circular reasoning. They say there's no record of it, but that's exactly what Luke is providing. He's providing a record, but they just don't accept his record because they're critics. But it's circular reason to say there's no record when in fact Luke is providing just that as one of the best historians of the 1st century. Is it significant? Critics say it's significant that Caesar Augustus never mentioned Luke's census. But Sir William Ramsay, again, responded to that. The silence of Augustus about the scheme of an imperial census affords no argument against his having projected such a scheme. In his review of his career, Augustus says nothing about the reorganization of the provincial administration, which to our judgment is almost the important fact of his career. So, in other words, Augustus in his own personal writings doesn't mention many things that are important parts of his record, so it's not a surprise if he fails to mention the census to which Luke refers. Is it significant that Josephus in his writings, the Jewish historian of the first century, is it surprising that he doesn't mention it? Craig Evans says Josephus is not always reliable. However, since in many other cases Luke proves to be much more reliable than Joseph. So maybe Josephus overlooked this census, doesn't mention it, but Evans is clear that he's no more reliable than Luke is. Luke has actually proven himself to be more reliable than Josephus. Likewise, Darrell Bach showed that it is not unusual that Josephus failed to record important details related to censuses carried out by Rome. And he says, Josephus' silence about an earlier census is shaky grounds for arguing that no earlier census took place. For as Hales points out in his Jewish War, Josephus left out other historically verified censuses unmentioned. So we shouldn't let the fact that Josephus doesn't mention this particular census bother us. There's certainly no argument against the historicity of Luke's writing. Now, Ramsay and other historians of the time began to uncover proof that the Romans carried out periodic enrollments, much like the one described by Luke. And so Ramsay said the decree of Augustus, which Luke mentioned, is commonly interpreted as ordering that a single census should be held of the whole Roman world. This is not a correct interpretation of Luke's words. He uses the present tense, and it means that Augustus ordered enrollments to be regularly taken. What Augustus did was to lay down the principle of systematic enrollment in the Roman world, not to arrange for the taking of one single census. So they did regular enrollments just like we do in the United States of America. And he provides evidence for these enrollments. Again, William Ramsay. Recently, 3 different scholars announced, now remember he's writing about a century ago, but it said recently 3 different scholars announced about the same time and independently of one another the discovery that periodical enrollments were made in Egypt under the Roman Empire, and that the period was not 15 years as in the later system of indications, but of 14 years. Again, referring to this cycle, these were made in Syria and elsewhere. According to Luke, the first enrollment was made a few years BC in the unknown year of Christ's birth, which is variously fixed and must have been somewhere between 8 and 3 BC, fitting right with what Luke has provided for us. So he continues to provide more information about these periodic enrollments. I'm going to keep moving in the interest of time. So is 8 BC the likely time for the start of the enrollment under the Romans too early for the birth of Christ? And the answer is it likely took some time for it to be completed, possibly many years. Paul Meyer, the historian, church historian, said the census mentioned in the Christmas story was probably a provincial enrollment associated with the citizen census of 8 BC, but apparently the machinery necessary to take it in far-off Palestine was not prepared until 5 BC. Well, just think how long it takes us to do a census in America with all our modern technology. Well, critics claim Luke erred by suggesting that the Romans would have conducted a census in the territory of a vassal king. So this is a little different because Herod was ruling as a client king, ruling for the Romans. And so the argument is that normally the client king would collect the taxes, and so there wouldn't be necessary for Herod or for the Romans to conduct a census in his territory. And so this critic, Mike Davis, says, during the reign of Herod and of Archelaus as well, who followed him, his son, there would have been no need for a Roman census, since it was the king's responsibility to figure out how to extract the required revenue from his subjects. Is he correct? No doubt conducting the census in the vassal state of Israel would have been a problem, and it was not the normal procedure. Nevertheless, there are good reasons we'll find why the Romans would have conducted this census under Herod the Great's nose. Jack Finnegan pointed to other examples where vassal kings of Rome were forced to allow a Roman census in their territories, including Syria and, I don't know how to pronounce that, Apamea, I'm going to guess. So there's historical evidence to show a similar situation. Harold W. Horner, in his Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ, a fantastic book if you want to look at chronological issues related to the life of Christ. Get that book. It's a fantastic book. Paperback, short little book, but filled with great evidence. Here's an example of it. Normally, it seems that Herod collected his own taxes and paid tribute to Rome. However, in 8 and 7 BC, Herod came into disfavor with Augustus, Caesar Augustus, of course, and was treated as a subject rather than a friend. It is interesting to note that the people of Herod's domain took an oath of allegiance to Augustus and Herod, which points to a greater involvement of Augustus in Herod's realm. Herod was getting old and ill, and he had much trouble with his sons who were struggling to acquire the throne. That's an understatement because he had 3 of his own sons and his wife executed out of insane jealousy. Horner goes on to say, hence it would have been a good time for Augustus to have an assessment of the domain before Herod's death so as to prepare for the future rule of his realm. Therefore, since Augustus had taken censuses in other vassal kingdoms, and since Herod had come into the emperor's disfavor as well as having troubles in his realm, it is more than probable that Augustus had conducted a census assessing Herod's kingdom while Herod was still alive. So that's a real refutation of the claims of the critics. Critics claim that Luke erred by suggesting that a Roman census required citizens to return to their ancestral homes. So why did Joseph have to leave Nazareth to go down to Bethlehem for a census? And Mike Davis, the skeptic, says, unless Joseph owned property in Bethlehem, there would be no reason for him to take part, and certainly no reason for Mary to accompany him on the journey. However, if Joseph did own property in Bethlehem, an assumption now warranted by Luke's story, it is difficult to explain why he and Mary stayed in a stable instead of their own property. So that's the criticism. What's the response? Participation in the census need not have been limited to land or property owners, as though they were the only ones that paid taxes. A Roman census also included registration, as in the modern sense of a census, wanting to know who was there, and even loyalty oaths to Caesar. Further, it is more reasonable to trust the historical reliability of Luke, who was a contemporary witness of the events, rather than the speculations of our modern critics. Excuse me, I was about to sneeze. I think my allergies are kicking in. Now, did Jesus own property in Bethlehem? It's not impossible, and it could have been that it was just land. It was out a distance away from town, or there could be many reasons why there wouldn't have been a place for Joseph, even if he did own land, and requiring them to stay at the inn. Moving on, in the interest of time, why would Mary accompany Joseph? Well, we can imagine that there was a lot of gossip going on in the little village of Nazareth, and that she would have been ostracized in her community for the mysterious circumstances of her pregnancy with Jesus. And also, it could be that Joseph wants to protect her and be there for her when it's time to give birth. Quite reasonable that she traveled with him. My old pastor, Dr. Bavir, used to say, is it a surprise that Mary gave birth in Bethlehem? Well, just ride on a donkey for 60 miles during the last month of your pregnancy. And he said, it's not surprising that she gave birth once she got there. In conclusion, doubtless our difficulty in determining this chronology arises from our ignorance, not from the authors. Bogger, the Lutheran pastor, said, we have seen then that rather there being insuperable historical difficulties related to Luke's description of a census that brought the Holy Family from Nazareth to Bethlehem, there are in fact multiple proposed solutions, any one of which history may ultimately vindicate. In the face of the above, critical humility is in order. And I was thinking, so I don't know which, I've gone back and forth on which one seems to be the best solution for the problems raised by the critics. But I was thinking it was kind of like if you were at a table in a room and there was one cookie on the table and there were 6 people in the room, and then the lights go out, and when the lights come back on, the cookie's gone. Now, I can't prove which person in the room took the cookie, but it's a very reasonable to suppose that somebody, one of those 6, took the cookie. And my point in that is there are several good explanations that clear up the criticism, particularly whether Cyrenius was involved in the census and whether it was it the 86? Did Luke make the mistake of conflating the 86 census with Luke's census under Herod the Great? And we've seen there's several proposals that remove that solution. I don't know which one it is. I don't know who took the cookie in the example, but the critics are wrong to say that Luke has screwed up. The critics are the ones that need to be humble and face the fact that everywhere we look, Luke has been so reliable, and William Ramsey and other archaeologists have taken the shovel to Israel, and over again, they have found that how accurate Luke was. And so he deserves to be respected in what he said about Luke's census. So at this time, I'll ask if there's any comments or questions.
The idea about Luke owning property, I'm sorry.
Joseph, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Joseph owning property, I don't know, in my mind, Mary and Joseph were about 14.
Well, most historians think that Mary was probably that age and that Joseph the boys tended to marry around 18 or so, and the girls 14, 13, 15.
Okay.
So they were certainly a young couple, but it would have been inherited land, like family land. Not that he had gone down there and made some deals,
Yeah.
doing a Donald Trump investment thing, but that his family ancestry is from. So it doesn't matter. Luke does not say that he owned land in Bethlehem. It's just a speculation. The critic thought that that would be a reason why he might have been called down there. But then to say, well, if that's true, why didn't he have a place to stay? Why did he have to stay in the inn? And my response is, even if it were true that Joseph owned land in Bethlehem, it could have been undeveloped land, a distance from town, not a good place for you to have a baby. And so that's just a speculation and a response to a speculation. But it's not necessary to defend Luke on that, because Luke does not say that Joseph owned land. And that there are records, and Sir William Ramsay does talk about in his book how Roman residents were required to return to their ancestral land. There is evidence of that in the archaeological record. Any other thoughts or comments?
Slipped my mind. I'll come back.
How did they know if somebody registered? I mean, did they leave like a card or a symbol? I mean, it's just one.
I don't know. I know the Romans were certainly very well able to administer government, and you can find scraps and records of things. In fact, one of the most famous statements in the New Testament, John 19:30, Jesus is hanging on the cross, and he says, "Tetelestai, it is finished," and they know what that means because they have found scraps in the area in first century Palestine that say Tetelestai, which was written on it when you bought something and you paid it off as like the pink slip. It said it's finished. So archaeologists have found these evidence scraps, and so I don't have any doubt that they had written records and were able to keep track. And then of course we looked at one of the slides, shows that there were records kept in the archive. Was it in Rome or Jerusalem? I know for sure in Jerusalem they kept, at the temple, they kept very strict records of their genealogies, and those were all burned up in AD 70 in Rome. I mean, in Jerusalem by the Romans. So there was records in the temple, and the Romans administered, and I think they said that their records were kept also in Rome. So I could look through it, but at any rate, I feel pretty confident that those records were available at the time, and people could go check them out. Any other thoughts? Or yeah.
Yeah, I guess just the journey into Bethlehem. I mean, in all the movies, it shows like where Mary's like 9.5 months pregnant, like this, like a watermelon, and
Yeah.
and she finally arrives at the inn, and then she has her baby. But isn't it possible that she was only like 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 months pregnant?
And that there was a delay. Well, I think against that is they would have been in that time, if they were there for months, they would have been able to find and
yeah,
procure a place to stay. But you know, coming down from Nazareth in Galilee down to Jerusalem, normally, well, the quickest way would be to just go south through Samaria, but most Jews didn't do that. So they tended to travel in caravans and travel along the Jordan River Valley. And it could be cold and wet during that time of year. It could be, they had to watch out for robbers, and so bandits, so they had to travel in groups. And so more than likely, Joseph and Mary traveled with other travelers on their way down to Jerusalem, got down to Jericho, crossed the Jordan, and then headed over that way. And that journey was that was about 60 miles. So you can imagine, how challenging that would be for a pregnant woman making that journey. And as I said, that donkey bouncing up and down, I can see where that would bring on labor for a woman that is ready to give birth to a child. Others have talked about how interesting it is that Almighty God moved heaven and earth to get that child born in the right place, because they're living up in Nazareth, but God made sure that the Roman government had that census in place, which would require Joseph and Mary to move down to Bethlehem. I mean, it just shows the providential hand of God in bringing everything to pass just as he said that it would. No accidents involved there at all. Were you going to say something else?
Oh, I was just gonna, I've always wondered, I've heard different theories about who Theophilus is. What's your opinion?
Yeah, you can open up any standard Bible commentary, and they'll usually provide 2 or 3 possibilities that Theophilus might have just been like a pseudonym for somebody, or it might have been an actual Roman official, an important Roman official that Luke was trying to impress and say, I know you hear these rumors about Christianity. We want you to hear the real story of Christianity and about Christ. Because to the Romans, or to the Roman mind, who is Jesus? He's just this common criminal that was executed by our governor Pilate. And even the Jews would look, it's looked down on it as a shameful thing to be executed as a common criminal. But Luke wants to tell the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, that this was actually God's whole purpose and design for bringing the Son of God into the world so that he could bear the salvation of the world. So Theophilus, I don't think historians have identified who exactly he is, but to me, the most reasonable thing is that he is an important Roman official, and Luke is sometimes credited as being the gospel that is written to Gentiles versus Matthew, more focused to the Jews, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
That makes sense.
But yeah, pick up a commentary and the introduction, and you'll usually get 2 or 3 of the most common views. Which one is the case? I think it's probably what I suggested.
Yeah, when you look at Luke and Acts that he wrote, he was pretty detailed. I mean, in his accounts of things.
Yeah, I mean, look how William Ramsey was able to basically use the book of Luke and Acts, which many people believe were a 2-part book, really all together, written and produced at the same time by Luke. But you could take his book and take your shovel out and start digging where he suggested, where things occurred. And many things were found just because of that. So he's been verified and vindicated as an excellent historian. That doesn't stop the skeptics. If you don't want to believe something, you'll always find some reason not to believe. But then that's really a problem of the heart. It's your heart. And there's some people that just shake their fist at God and refuse to believe, no matter how strong the evidence is. And the evidence supporting Luke's census is really strong. But it won't surprise me that despite it, that skeptics will continue to disbelieve it because they are bent against God.
I never thought twice about it. It's just something I always breeze through in the Christmas story that, the census was taken up in Syria, Quirinius was governor, and okay, fine, and I kept reading it. I never knew that there was controversy, that skeptics, kind of took hold by the neck and, tried to squeeze every little drop of skepticism out of that. And
It's true. I mean, critics, skeptics will tear apart the New Testament they try to find any little mistake that they can find, not only with the Christmas story, but with the whole story of the New Testament. Jesus, Luke just created the stories about Jesus based on Greek mythology or based on Alexander the Great, or what. You can make up anything, you can speculate anything. What the New Testament and the apologists have defended the New Testament's veracity, but as far as the overall nativity story of Christ, they have problems with. They claim that Christ wasn't born on December 25th, or he wasn't born in the winter, but there is solid reasons to believe that those are true. They claim that Christmas was based on earlier Roman celebrations like the Saturnalia and Sol Invictus, but modern historians are showing that those theories are wrong, and that the Christmas has been celebrated, or the birth of Christ has been celebrated by Christians going back to the first century, from the very beginning. And not to do a plug, but I have a book out on the table if anybody's interested, in defense of Christmas, where I look at how modern historians are changing the old views and coming to the defense of Luke and the New Testament story of the Nativity of Christ. So any other comments before we wrap it up? Thank you guys all for coming, and God bless. Have a great day.